and to everyone here from the Confederation Club. It's always a pleasure as well as a challenge to try to convert my thoughts, which generally exist as 850 incoherent words on paper or on the screen, into something coherent over 25 minutes for a live audience. And that certainly goes double today, because I've been asked to make some observations on Canada's 150th birthday. Certainly a momentous event in our country's life, and one that I would like to try to do justice to. So, where to start? Well, it seems to me the most obvious place to start is with women's professional golf. This past April, Lexi Thompson, who some of you golfers out there might know, came second at the Manulife Classic in Whistlebear just last week. Lexi Thompson was assessed a 4-stroke penalty for a ball placement infraction in a U.S. tournament. She put down her coin, she picked up her ball, she thought about it, she put the ball back down, and she played on. At the time, no one had anything to say about it, mainly because there was nothing to see. But the next day, officials informed her that she'd been assessed the 4-stroke penalty because someone at home had watched the replay of that little event on a high-definition, slow-mo replay, and she noticed that where Lexi picked up the ball and where Lexi put the ball back down again in relation to the coin she placed were different by the slightest of margins, perhaps less than an inch. But certainly on this replay, if you slowed it down and compared the two moments, they were certainly just slightly different. Because of that, she was assessed the 4-stroke penalty, she forfeited her lead, and she ended up losing a playoff round. Same thing happened to Anna Nordquist a year ago. She was in a bunker. As she addressed the ball, you could see someone once again blew it up on high-definition slow-mo replay. You could see there's this tiny little mountain of sand at microscopic level, and when she addressed the ball, this tiny little bit fell off this little mountain, and so that constituted a violation. Obviously, you're not allowed to touch the sand when you're in a bunker while addressing the ball. Once again, that cost her the victory. Both examples, and there's plenty of those. I think any golfer, and I'm not really much of a golfer, but I think anyone who's interested in fair play would consider these examples to be rather absurd. And to their credit, the ruling bodies of golf agreed. They took action after the Lexi Thompson predicament, and they changed the rules. And from now on, video replay in golf is constrained by what is called the naked eye standard. Recognizing that video technology makes it possible to pick up things that are impossible to see with the unaided naked eye, golf officials are now instructed to ignore any video replay evidence that exceeds the capacity of the unaided human eye. The new rules, to quote, that evidence from video replay technology should not be used to hold players to a higher standard than human beings can be reasonably expected to meet. I think this is a very important statement. That people should not be held, evidence from the past should not be used to hold players to a higher standard than human beings can reasonably expect it to meet. And I think this applies not just to women's golf, but to all professional sports, and if you'll indulge me for a few more minutes, we'll get to its applicability to Canadian history as well. But first, because it's real bee in my bonnet, I want to finish off this notion of the problems with video replay in professional sports. We've come to rely on video replay in nearly all professional sports as a panacea for human fallibility. There's this assumption that if we simply add more cameras, better technology, higher high definition, slower slow-mo, more experts in some command centers far away, that we can achieve the perfectly officiated game, a game without controversy, a game where every disputed call can be adjudicated in a way that eliminates any doubt and complaint. But what we're learning, and eventually I'll get to why this applies to history too, but what we're learning is that it's impossible. for a couple of reasons, for 3 reasons. One is there'll never be an end to controversy in sports, regardless of how much technology we apply. Even, I don't know if there's some hockey fans out here, they might remember the Oilers-Ducks series, where there was a last-minute goal by the Ducks that was somewhat disputed by the Oilers. You could see Ryan Kessler had grabbed the Edmonton goalie Cam Talbot's pad and prevented him from sliding across the crease to make a play. The Ducks scored in the final minute. They went on to win in overtime. You could argue that changed the complexion of the series for sure, and perhaps the Stanley Cup Finals as well. There was plenty of video evidence that this happened, but the call stood, and so there will always be controversy. Whenever we're dealing with humans in conflict with one another or interacting with one another, there will always be some sort of controversy. Two, the alleged precision that we gain from technology is a false sense of precision. It implies a level of exactness that's not really an essential part of what it is we like about sports. Most sports people watch on television, they're fast and rough and chaotic, thinking hockey and football, perhaps not golf. But we watch them because they present us with exemplars of human skill and creativity and endurance. We don't watch because we like watching. We don't watch sports because we like seeing referees look at their iPads or put on headsets and talk to people in command centers somewhere. Neither do we watch sports because we're interested in technology or video replay capabilities. All this, I think, these endless delays you get with replay betrays the essential qualities of what it is we like about sports, which are the excitement, the unpredictability, the communal participation, the storylines that develop as human beings interact with one another. And third, the closer you look, the more penalties you're always going to find. Another example from baseball, last year the Blue Jays successfully challenged a stolen base by the Oakland A's because as the Oakland, it looked from in real speed, it looked like a perfectly legitimate stolen base, but if you slowed it down enough, you could see that as the Oakland A's player's knee hit the bag, it just bumped up just because of the physics of the thing, bumped up ever so slightly, created a little bit of daylight between him and the bag. At that moment, the tag was applied, and on video replay evidence, he was declared out. That is a play that 10 years ago or before video replay, that was a play that was a good stolen base, but the infraction was discovered only through the application of technology. So it's a call that could only be made with video replay. Same goes with football. I mean, whether the receiver's toe was on the white line when he caught it, we treat video replay in football like it's the Zapruder footage. But the thing is, if you had a camera on every offensive lineman a separate camera on every defensive back, it would be just non-stop penalties. Every play would be a flag because you would see so much that it just can't stand that level of scrutiny. So replay doesn't solve complaints about controversy or penalties. It creates them. And I think that comes at the expense of what we really like about sports. So I could go on and on. Perhaps you could tell what I dislike about video replay for the rest of our time here. But I did promise to make this about Canadian history and Canada's 150th anniversary. So I should probably make a heroic leap into the past right now. So here it goes. Everything I just said about video replay applies equally well to the problems with how we remember Canadian history today. It's become axiomatic that you don't discuss Canadian history in the midst of Canada 150. The preferred topic of conversation is clearly gigantic rubber duckies. Which is a shame. Canadian history is to be avoided in our sesquicentennial year. When CBC tried to produce a generally laudatory version of our history, it was attacked for everything that it left out as well as everything that it put in. If Canadian history is mentioned today in polite company, it is generally only as a reason for us to hang our heads in shame at the long list of irredeemable bastards and catastrophic embarrassments and pseudo-war crimes that apparently comprise the entirety of our past. I think that's a shame. We no longer celebrate the building of the Trans-Canada Railway anymore, as we once did. Now we lament the treatment of the laborers who worked on it. We don't marvel at the fact that in 1900, a country of less than 5.5 million people welcomed over 3 million immigrants by 1914. That's an increase of 60% in a decade and a half. Instead we spend all our time apologizing for the few hundred people that we didn't let in. It's no longer a point of national pride that our relationship with the Indigenous community during the colonial era was one of generally one of cooperation, and that we avoided the terrible wars and massacres and double dealing that has been the case over and over again in the United States. And instead, all we talk about is the residential school system. I want to be clear, I'm not saying we should in any way diminish or ignore the past mistakes that Canada has made. We should acknowledge the treatment of Chinese railway workers and the Komagatu-Maru incident, and certainly residential schools. Canada has certainly made its share of mistakes. Where we've gone wrong, it's improper. It's proper that we shine a light on that and that we apologize and learn from the errors. And I think by and large we've done that. But all this shouldn't become a reason for us to ignore or eliminate the many other monumental stories from our past and the people who made it all happen. We shouldn't allow shame for one or for some incidences to affect the balance of history. But I think this is precisely what has happened. And it has happened for the same reasons that video replay is ruining professional sports. We've become obsessed with a high-definition, slow-motion, micro-focused replay of our past. We go looking for penalties, so to speak, and problems, and by and large we find them. And what we've lost is the bigger, broader sense of the story that Canadian history should tell. So we no longer look objectively at our own history, but instead it's intensely subjective. I think the most obvious example of this damaging trend can be found in the recent demands that you hear from Native groups and other activist groups that the names of various Canadian historical figures be removed from buildings and historical sites. I'm going to pick a couple of examples that you may have heard of. One is the effort to remove Hector Louis Langevin's name from the Parliament Hill building that houses the Prime Minister's office, the Langevin block in Ottawa. Native leaders claim that because he was the politician in the cabinet of Sir John A. MacDonald who formalized the residential school system, that he has lost the right to be honored with an important building in Ottawa. Certainly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report makes repeated mention of Langevin's speech on this topic in 1883. He said, and I'll quote, "If you wish to educate the Native children, you must separate them from the parents. If you leave them in the family, they may know how to read and write, but they will still remain savages." Certainly taken on its own, that's a devastating indictment to modern ears. But what if we let the tape roll a bit? What if we see what happened a little later in that play? In the same speech in 1883, Langevin concluded that it was his intention to give every Native child who graduated from residential school a free homestead. It's actually quite an enlightened approach that he took. It's certainly not the sign of someone who intended to be evil. And in responding to Langevin, the leader of the Liberal Party of the day, Edward Blake, so at one point that would be Justin Trudeau's historical doppelganger, he not only used terminology that we would consider incredibly insulting today, he complained that Langevin's plan was far too generous, that he'd prefer that the government of the day spend much less money on Native residential schools than Langevin was planning to do. So clearly the narrow focus on one sentence in one speech doesn't really give us the full historical flavor of what was happening, but it's it's been used as damning evidence of Langevin's unfitness to be memorialized in our nation's capital. Is this really how we should be making decisions about our modern age? Another example, these are all difficult stories, but I think we need to consider them from a holistic perspective. Edward Cornwallis, the founder of Halifax, you may have also heard there's a campaign to eliminate his name from the city he founded. They've taken his name off of a junior high in Halifax. There's also a campaign to have a statue of him hidden from view, and to take his name off a park and some streets. The reason is that Cornwallis issued a bounty of 10 British guineas for every scalp of Mi'kmaq warriors that were delivered to him during a war with natives and some French settlers. It's known as Father Le Loutre's War in 1750. That certainly happened. You can find the precise terms of Cornwallis's declaration with about 10-second search on Google. And I'm not going to defend Cornwallis or scalping in general. But once again, there's a more fulsome story to be told. It took me quite a bit more research, but for this talk, I did quite a bit of poking around on the story of Cornwallis. And I finally found a French language academic paper that describes the policy on scalp bounties in New France, where they certainly were paying bounties to the Mi'kmaq for English scalps. The going rate in New France was about 30 livres, which is less than 10 British guineas. But curiously enough, it was a standing offer. That was a deal that was always available for any native who wanted to deliver a scalp to New France colonial administrators. In Anglo-American colonies, scalp bounties were used only in times of war, and the rate actually varied quite significantly based on how the war was going and the panic level of the population. And Father Le Loutre himself, who was the dark genius behind this particular war, he made an explicit promise to the Mi'kmaqs that he would pay bounties for English scalps. And that's what provoked the British into action. So is Cornwallis worthy of memorialization? He's probably not Canada's most competent military leader, but he was without question the founder of Halifax. And it seems to me wholly unfair to use his scalping bounty proclamation as evidence against him when everyone else in the area, including the natives who today demand that his name be removed, were engaged in exactly the same repulsive tactic. I'm running out of time here. I could go on this as well as sports, but Jeffrey Amherst is another figure who I think has gotten the bum's rush from history. He's another British general. He's popularly considered the father of germ warfare for allegedly giving smallpox-laden blankets to natives. It's completely false. He never did it. He mentioned it once in a letter as a footnote to say to someone else who suggested that he was going to do it. And as a matter of fact, the only one time that the smallpox blankets were ever given to the natives had already occurred before Amherst wrote this in his letter. So he's certainly not the father of germ warfare by any stretch. He may not, again, have been a nice guy, but I think we need to remember people in the context of their times. So, as with video replay, I hope you're sort of getting my point here, is that video replay in sports has not eliminated controversy. There will always be controversy because it deals with human interaction. The same is the case with history. It is foolish to believe that simply by purging some bad apples from the historical record that we can somehow create a version of our history that is palatable to everyone. What actually happens when you look at history in a very narrow way at any particular event or any particular historical figure is that you're inevitably going to find something that's repulsive or at the very least at sharp odds with present day norms. As with sports, the closer you look, the more penalties you're going to find. And this creates a false sense of precision. It suggests that we've lost sight of the bigger picture of Canadian history and why it should be important to us. How should we properly recognize Canadian history? Well, I think we should do as golf has done and apply the naked eye standard. I don't think historical figures should be held to a higher standard than human beings can be reasonably expected to meet, as in the words of the golf's ruling body. No one's a saint, and not today and not in the past. So what would a naked eye standard of history look like? Well, we're actually quite lucky in Waterloo Region to have what I think is a perfect example of such a thing. And it's the Prime Minister's statue project in Baden. We should probably consider this to be a naked eye history in action. And while it started off as kind of a bad story, it is certainly currently in sounds to me like a good story. I hope most of you are familiar with this tale. It started off with a statue of Sir John A. MacDonald that was commissioned. Originally it was going to be put in Victoria Park in Kitchener, but the local residents there didn't want it. When the statue itself was finally cast, it had to be unveiled at a Kitchener Rangers game because there was nowhere else to host it. It spent a while in a doorway on King Street, sort of like a hobo. And then Wilfrid Laurier University said they'd take it, and then the students and the faculty were aghast. There was a report from the school's Board of Governors that said it was against the policies of inclusivity and diversity to display the physical representation of Canada's founding father. I could do a whole talk on that one line, maybe another time. But anyways, as it all worked out, Castle Kilbride in Baden said they would be happy to have the statue of not just Sir John A. Macdonald, but all the subsequent prime ministerial statues. You may be aware that it was announced just last week of some company for Sir John A. Macdonald. Lester Pearson and William Lyon Mackenzie King statues are going to be unveiled on June 29th out there, and Sir Robert Borden is going to be unveiled around Remembrance Day. What's important, what emphasizes the naked eye standard of history for me with these statues is both stylistically and symbolically, they don't put their subjects on pedestals. These are designed as sort of ground level statues. You can, the Sir John A. Macdonald one, if you've seen it, it's him holding two chairs representing English and French Canada, bringing them together, but you can sit in the chairs. They make wonderful photo opportunities. This is Sir John A. Macdonald on the ground level. The intent with these statues, I haven't seen the other ones because they haven't been unveiled yet, but certainly the intent running through this whole project is to present Canada's figures in a objective manner, fair and historically relevant. Certainly, they will not be glossing over the faults of these men and one woman. There's all sorts of engravings and what they call Easter eggs, little sort of symbols and hints and clues, as well as the documentation that goes with the statues that suggest to everyone to consider these people in their whole, both the time that they lived in and the fullness of their accomplishments. And I think that's appropriate for historical figures. These are important members of our past, and if anyone happens to think that Canada today is a great and wonderful country, which I happen to, then I think we should always find room to thank the men and women who got us here by whatever route. This is where we have arrived, and we wouldn't have arrived here without everyone that has gone before us. So with this in mind, I would encourage all of you today for your own personal Canada 150 celebration to make the trek out to Baden at some point and perhaps at the unveiling ceremony on the 29th of June or at some other time, and to take an opportunity to reflect on the fullness of Canadian history, and I would recommend that you do it with your own naked eye. So, thank you very much. As we said, I'm happy to take questions or comments or anything like that.
Directors, if you have